Ladies and gentlemen, we now have a very high-level panel for you discussing some of the questions which have been raised by introductory remarks so far. A global transformation shaping Europe's future, focusing on the two major concerns which we've heard about already, climate change and geopolitical shifts. So we'll have a roundtable which will take place in two phases, and I'm delighted to ask you to welcome the first three speakers onto the stage. Please welcome Lieutenant Colonel Johannes Breitholz, Yuri Fedorev, and Barbara Teixeira Araujo. Please welcome them. Thank you. Yes, here we go. Thank you very much indeed for your presence here today to discuss with us these very important topics. Let me tell you a little bit more about who we are on the panel. We're delighted to have Lieutenant Colonel Johannes Breitholz. You are a Swedish veteran from Afghanistan, now working as team leader for EU and NATO policy at the Swedish Armed Forces Directorate for Strategic Plans and Policy. You're also a father of four and a devoted football coach, which I'm sure influences many of your decisions concerning the future. Yuri Fedorev, we're delighted to have you with us. You're head of Financial Services Advisory, and you lead the financial sector work at KPMG in Ukraine. You arrived in Spain from Ukraine yesterday, and you will share your observations on developments at the moment in your country. We're very touched that you are here with us. Thank you very much indeed. And last but by no means least, we're delighted to have Barbara Teixeira Araujo. You're a senior economist at Moody's Analytics, where you lead a team providing real-time analysis of key European economies with a special focus on policy. In your personal time, you find balance through meditation, and you enjoy fusing the vibrant flavors of Brazilian cuisine with European gastronomy. So please, could you give a big round of applause? It's always nice for people who come on the stage to have a warm feeling from the room. I won't be asking you too many questions about cuisine, but you can talk about that in the break afterwards with anybody who's interested. The format will be very simple. I'm going to ask you introductory questions, maybe 10 minutes each. Then for a quarter of an hour, I'll get you talking together. Then we'll invite the other two panel members up to talk about climate change issues. Now, I'm going to start with you, Johannes Breitholz. Ursula von der Leyen's plan to develop a European defence union. I'm interested to have your take, because you work very closely with this, on how that's compatible with NATO, and how do you see some of the questions that Carl Bildt was talking about, how do you see this developing in the very risky world in which we live?
Okay, thank you.
If you could answer that in 10 minutes,
okay.
You could talk for about, I'm sure, for about 5 hours, but 10 minutes would be cool. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Alex. Yeah, we live in indeed troublesome times, as Carl Bildt mentioned earlier, and geopolitics is in everybody's minds, and great power competition is back on the agenda. And this year brings some new major players to the table, with half of the world's populations going to the ballots, and also new leadership in NATO. Following the European election, where Ursula von der Leyen remains at the helm, her focus now shifts even more towards defense and security. And in my opinion, even though she speaks about a European defense union, it remains to be seen how this shift will, with the appointment of Kubilius as a defense commissioner, how that shift really will be. The idea of strengthening European defense cooperation is far from new. Initiatives being launched from time to time. During the post-Cold War years, up until the mid-2010s, the main focus for this cooperation was industrial production, with efforts to achieve the pooling and sharing of military capabilities. At that time, and especially following the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, the goal was mostly to manage shrinking defense budgets while still maintaining a functional defense of Europe. During this era, the main task for the military was also stabilizing missions, especially in Africa and Middle East, and national defense forces were redesigned accordingly. Even though the signals came already with Putin's famous speech in Munich in 2007, and of course with the invasion of Georgia in 2008, it was not until the annexation of Crimea in 2014 that focus started to shift back to national defense and allied deterrence. The full-scale attack on Ukraine in 2022 gave the real push to that effort, while also introducing the task of supporting to Ukraine, a task that now is at the forefront of most Western countries and top defense priorities. But returning to your question, most European countries are both members of NATO and EU, and most agree that it's important that each body does what it's best at, avoiding ineffective duplication of tasks. I think that the key word for EU is, in this regard is coordination. The Union has powerful tools at its hands, especially when it comes to financing and setting rules and regulations within the Union. In the defense field, that means, for instance, encouraging industrial cooperation, facilitating cooperation in specifying demands for new capabilities, and operationally it also means that making it easier to operate or transport military units within Europe. I think that NATO welcomes a better coordinated union. The risk that EU would reach for taking over or duplicating NATO competence is very small, as most allies and member states prefer a clear delineation. NATO will still be the main focus for deterrence and defense, with the EU as the most important supporting role. To sum up, it remains to be seen what the new initiatives entails, but there is undoubtedly a need for greater coordination of the efforts to support Ukraine, to build up European capabilities. And the main points for this new European Defence Union or the new Defence Commissioner would to be increased production, aggregating demands, and use Union tools to enable more efficient military operations in Europe, such as the military mobility corridors.
Thank you very much indeed for those introductory comments. Well, I'm sure you'll come back to some of the themes when we open up the discussion. Yuri Fedorov, we're delighted to have you with us today to give us a testimonial into the ongoing situation in Ukraine, how it's impacted local businesses, including the challenges faced and the resilience and strategies implemented. And also, I mean, you were, if I can say, you were just telling me that you've just arrived from Kiev. And every night you hear the sounds. Your children have to live with the sounds of these drones coming over the roof. I don't think we can imagine what that must be like. Can you tell us what it's like, not only in terms of your personal family life, but for businesses in the current situation?
Yes. Hi, everyone. So first of all, I want to thank to FERMA for having Ukrainian agenda. So that's really important for Ukraine, and I want to thank you, everyone, and for support of Ukraine and Ukrainians. Today I'm going to speak on the challenges business faces these days in Ukraine. So I mean what's going on over there. So, but I will start maybe with that even before the full-scale war, Ukraine had a lot of challenges, and there was like a lot of room for improvement, just to transformation, I mean, of economy, of legal system, and to attract international investors and so on and so forth. But with the war, I mean, actually everything's changed. So, and the war actually touched everywhere, everyone and everywhere. So from business perspective, I mean, there were like such key challenges. So, I mean, lost territories, damaged assets, and blackouts, immigration of people, and so on and so forth. But the most important stuff is the valuable is people life. So unfortunately, we have a lot of people being killed on daily basis. This is terrible. Yeah, and I'm gonna just cover just a couple of examples for you to understand what's going on in Ukraine. So because we work with a number of our clients, and like back in 2022, late summer, so we are in the war for like 4 months, and we sit together with the client, and he had like challenge with debt restructuring, right? And he talked to his lenders, like local and international lenders. And international lenders, of course, understand this is the war, but they didn't feel, the details. But the story was like, it was the company, it was a very successful case. And what happened? So they lost some territories because some territories were occupied. So some fields, the companies was from agri sector. Some fields were mined. So it was impossible to work there. The port was closed, so they exported their commodities. The logistic increased 10 times. So you cannot imagine 10 times because there is no actually direct route to the port they used to work with, and they had to find different supply chain routes. And the vessels on the river, was not allowed during the war, so they couldn't transport by the river. And it was the real story. So, from first perspective, actually, at that time, it was like disaster. But in 1 year, so everything changed dramatically. So we have the largest port in Ukraine operational with support of the agreement with the United Nations, right? So we have built all the logistics within the country. So we have different routes. So the logistic cost already not so high. So, and we have a lot of on the western part of Ukraine that is more safe. So a lot of new logistics centers, new transportation opportunities, and so on and so forth. So, in 1 year term, the situation, the company managed to improve all the situation, and situation is completely different. So right now, company has strong business case, so they operate but still in the same environment. So, the conclusion is that despite this terrible situation, the big challenge at the beginning, so the company managed to go through these challenges and to have another successful case. This is the first story I want to tell. The second one is very interesting because we work with many companies, and we work on business continuity processes or business continuity management, right? So before the war, it was rather theoretical exercise, right? So because what will happen theoretically in case of no electricity, let's say, right? In Ukraine, it doesn't work in this way because there is no electricity. This is a reality. So after some attacks on the energy infrastructure, so here maybe I will describe a little bit more, because the energy infrastructure and principal infrastructure are main targets for the Russians to attack. So we have Ukrainian energy sector from generation perspective looks like we have 50% nuclear, then 40% thermal, and then 10% mix of hydro, renewables, and so on and so forth. So the thermal part is completely destroyed. So this 40%, right? So, and but still, we used to have to be without light and without electricity for 1, 2, 3 days, actually in the row, right? But what we did, we started to build immediately distributed generation, and even just recent times, if there were last attacks, so we try to fix everything within a couple of weeks. So people can stay without electricity, stayed without electricity for 1, 2 weeks, but just some hours, right? So, again, so challenge, and all Ukrainians, government, and with support of international donors, of course, so we managed to fix it everything and in very quick manner. So business continuity, just to return to my story. Like we don't have like the theoretical exercises, we have very practical exercises, right? So like we say, company, I mean, what are your key processes you want to keep if there is no electricity for 2 days, right? So because I mean, previously they said, well, all processes are very important. These days they understand there are like 2 or 3 key processes they want to preserve in terms of anything, right? Another like peculiarity is who is owner of the business process, right? So it's very simple process. You cannot say like these 2 gentlemen will be responsible for this process because of the very simple reason. Tomorrow these 2 gentlemen can be called to the army. So and I mean there would be I mean no one responsible for that process, right? So and we need to think who are the right people working for that process. It can be like 1 gentleman, 1 lady, just to have this diversification and so on and so forth. And I continued this stories for a long time because I mean, like in general there is war, but there are like many details we need to consider. So in every on our like daily life. So another point is challenge with people. That's true because we face like moving business from eastern part to western part of Ukraine, right? And the companies face the challenge of people because like according to latest United Nations analysis, more than 6 million Ukrainians were registered as refugees in Europe. And like more of them said that most likely they will not return back. So this is the challenge with the people, and I mean companies want to develop, they want to build new plants and new businesses, but the challenge is with qualified people. So because I mean some people immigrated and men joined actually the army. That's briefly it. I wanted to cover it from the like first glance, but in case of any questions, I'm here, so I would be happy to talk to you and just to return with my answers.
Thank you very much indeed, Yuri, for that quite exceptional description of the consequences of the conflict that you're unfortunately having to go through. Barbara, how, in terms of your analytics and what you do at Moody's, in the world we live in, we've just had a glaring example, very daunting effects. How do you, in terms of policy, how is it possible to conduct policy, to come up with policy, and what would be your initial remarks about what we've been hearing so far this morning about the ever riskier world we live in?
Yes, for us economists, I think there is fault lines are becoming increasingly apparent in Europe's economy. Growth has been very weak for the past 2 years, and it's not recovering in line with expectations. Recession risks, they have been rising again since the summer. Europe currently faces the highest risk among global trade partners, global regions. We see a 50-50 chance that Europe could fall into recession in the next 12 to 18 months. And the problem is that we're going increasingly worried that this persistent cyclical weakness that we are seeing in Europe, well, it's actually becoming a structural problem. And I'd say the concern is not that growth is low and it's actually below potential, but actually that potential growth itself in Europe is declining. And how does this tie in with the geopolitical shifts we're talking about? Well, it ties in quite significantly because geopolitical shifts are exacerbating this cyclical becoming structural trend, and they are laying bare Europe's productivity, Europe's competitiveness problems, as Carl Bildt was talking about before. So what's happened is that from an economic perspective, global markets, they have started to show this degree of fragmentation. From geopolitics to COVID, for various reasons, there is this muscular geoeconomic fragmentation that's been going on. And the US actively trying to de-risk from China, it's a prime example of that, with the EU seemingly caught in the middle. But there's also now the looming threat of a tariff war between the US and the EU. And this geoeconomic fragmentation, combined with seemingly ever-rising geopolitical tensions, well, it means that countries are now increasingly focusing on security. And here I don't mean solely military defense, but primarily economic security as well. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has shown the dangers of relying on one sole supplier, in this case for energy. The pandemic laid bare how we had underestimated supply chain risks. So that's why words such as resilience, self-reliance, de-risking, decoupling, reshoring, friendshoring, they have all come to the fore. And why they are now topping governments' priorities lists. And so what are governments actually doing to protect this economic security, to reduce economic vulnerabilities? Many things. But I have maybe two terms that have come to the fore, which are industrial policy and protectionism. Industrial policy, in simple terms, is when governments, they pick certain industries and they provide support through investments, through tax incentives, through subsidies. And when I talk about protectionism, I'm usually referring to tariffs, but also non-tariff barriers, and to trade wars in general. And the US Inflation Reduction Act is a poster child for industrial policy. It allocates over $250 billion to clean tech manufacturing in the US. China has also been injecting billions and billions of dollars in its green and tech industries and creating a lot of overcapacity that's then exported into the rest of the world. Europe has not been asleep at the wheel, as many say it has. The Net Zero Industry Act in 2023, it was Europe's first attempt at industrial policy, but with support amounting to less than 10%, what we have in the US IRA, Inflation Reduction Act. Well, it's clear why this hasn't been really a game changer for Europe. So, in my opinion, on the policy perspective, Europe really needs to stand up on its own. I think it needs to create its own muscular, ambitious industrial policy to avoid maybe being hollowed out by China or the US in certain sectors. And I think Germany is it's a very good example for that. Maybe you're all aware that Germany's economy it's really struggling, and most of the economy's problems, they stem from persistent weakness in its outsized manufacturing sector. Industrial production in Germany, it's more than 10% below pre-pandemic levels, and the country's GDP has declined last year. It's set to decline again this year. And what's happening in Germany is that the economy is really struggling to compete with the US and its IRA, with China and its subsidies, and it's really struggling to remain competitive. There's a lot of attention being paid to automotives, to especially EVs. I think the latest figures show that 1 in 5 EVs registered in Europe come from China. So this has raised alarm bells. And why is that? So the used automotives industry is massive. It's very, very important for Europe's economy. It accounts for more than 6% of the EU's GDP. It accounts for more than 7% of employment. So European policymakers, that especially in light of this competition from abroad, they are really under pressure to step up and to keep the industry afloat, to preserve jobs. But I think it's important to say that EVs are just one example, that there are many other industries that are at risk of losing out. For example, if you think of energy-intensive industries, most are struggling. Many have decided to relocate out of Europe because energy costs in Europe are really, really high, especially compared to the US or China. And well, the fact is, Europe is an energy importer, and since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's become very clear that Europe's macro model of relying a lot on cheap energy import from Russia, and as well as very accessible export markets, well, it's maybe no longer viable. We have to think of solutions. So energy security has come to the forefront once again. We cannot risk another energy crisis such as we had in 2022. We are all very aware of. We need to diversify our energy supplies. We need to fast-track renewable energy products so we can become more energy independent. We can become more economic secure. Take, for example, what's happening in the Middle East. If there is, let's say, all-out war between Israel and Iran, Iran might be tempted to close the Strait of Hormuz, which is a major choke point for oil transit and natural gas transit. And if that happens, we would see natural gas prices skyrocket, oil prices skyrocket, and this could lead to a global recession. So we have to be really aware that all these geopolitical shifts are having a big impact, and they are really threatening our economic security. And there's just two, so I'll just say, the EU needs now to find the right sectors in which to invest, be it renewable energy products, battery technology, energy grids, you name it. It needs to act and to choose what makes sense now in order to preserve its economic security. But, of course, this presents a major challenge, and I would say it's for two reasons. First, there's a lot of fragmentation, as Carl Bildt was referring to. We are not a fiscal union. We have 27 countries with 27 very different interests in the EU. So finding consensus is very, very difficult. And at the same time, we have very little fiscal space in Europe right now, especially in light of the EU's fiscal rules that have returned. But the EU has risen to challenges before, so it could rise to challenge once again. And I would say, just to sum up, we have this major economic shift underway. The focus is now on security, especially economic security. This is leading to a reshaping of trade patterns, investment patterns, and this reshaping of trade patterns and investment patterns, it's laying bare Europe's productivity, competitiveness problems. There are industries that are leaving Europe. So the EU really needs to gather its act and act. And I'm confident it can do something. It did a lot on the COVID crisis. It did a lot on after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So it could potentially do something really good now to strengthen its strategic position. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you all three of you for your general introduction and for giving us your individual takes on the landscape. I'd like to press you on several very concrete issues which you've all raised. For example, we're living in a very unpredictable world. You've all said so. The most unpredictable thing, I'm sure you turned on your televisions in your hotels this morning like I did to see President Trump serving chips, French fries. I mean, he might be the president in 2 weeks' time. You mentioned it. This is going to change everything, isn't it? If he is, it seems more and more likely that the Americans are going to re-elect him. What happens if they do? It's in 2 weeks' time.
Well, that's of course the big uncertainty in every aspect, and to look at what he says and what he will do is at top of many people's agenda, I think. And if he follows through with some of the things he's saying, it will be a huge challenge for Europe. And on the other hand, I think that all countries are prepared for that. They have seen it coming for quite some time, and they are starting to align with that or trying to live with that. And as you can see, what are stated from the, for instance, when Mark Rutte came to head of NATO, and he said that we will play with everyone who is on the dance floor. So it needs to step up, but I think that it also puts a lot of pressure on European cohesion and stepping up in the single market as well.
Yuri, I imagine everybody in Ukraine is, well, I don't know, but presumably worried about the prospect of Donald Trump, who's not the greatest supporter of Ukraine. What can you tell us about?
Yeah, maybe. So, I mean, for me, it's difficult, I mean, to tell, so, what will be impact on Ukraine, right? So, but here I have like two things to just put on top of my mind. I mean, we Ukrainians need to fight for our country, so it will not change our attitude, I mean, against Russians. We need to preserve our country, so because we are fighting for the existence of our country. So this is the first one. So the second one, if I recall correctly, Mr. Trump was president like 5 years ago, right? So, and it was war in Ukraine at that time already. So because the war started in 2014, right? And that time we had support from the US as well. So that's why, I mean, I still expect on some support from America, but that's my personal perception. But from geopolitical perspective, it's difficult to comment. So, but I still believe there would be support.
You touched on it, Barbara, but obviously one of the key policies which interests us that Trump is threatening to do, and even if it isn't Trump, Harris will have to deal with it, is the attitude towards China. I mean, that creates huge questions, instability. How do we make policy on that particular issue? And can the EU, I mean, we're supposed to be bigger than all these other people, and yet we seem to be very timid. Can the EU have similar policies to China? How are we going to deal with the new world if there's massive US-China conflict in terms of trade?
Yes, so I think there are basically 2 points here. First, former President Donald Trump, he has managed to introduce tariffs on China, but also on all US good imports. So this represents a major risk for Europe's economy. Now, if you think how the EU might respond to such tariffs, if he really decides to go through with this across-the-board tariffs, well, during Trump's first presidency, the EU did show it was willing to respond to tariffs. It imposed tariffs on sensitive US products such as Harley-Davidson motorcycles, tariffs on bourbon, in response to US tariffs on EU's steel and aluminium. So the EU is willing it shows it's willing to engage in a tariff war. But the problem this time around is that Trump it's threatening this across-the-board tariffs, which means that Europe this time it's unlikely to pick out sensitive sectors, but it would probably respond in kind. And this would have consequences for Europe's economy. It would be inflationary, it would lead to inflation, but much less than in the US, given that in the US he would be imposing tariffs across the board, and US trade represents only 14% of total EU imports. So the impact here would be less, and it would also, there would be some degree of substitutability away from US goods anyway. But there would also be an impact on growth. Nothing disastrous we wouldn't expect a recession in that scenario. But anyway, there would be, we would have slower growth than we otherwise expect. But also the impact maybe in the US would be larger. For the second point, I would say it's EU-China's relationship. Well, I don't think we can afford to do the same, to act the same way as the US is doing towards China. EU's and China's economies are really interlinked, interconnected. And while the EU really, it says it wants to keep this multipolar global order of trading-based relationships, it's really, it really needs to guarantee, as I was saying before, its economic security. It needs to guarantee access to sensitive technology and materials. And China is a very important trade partner, and it's really important for EU's decarbonization goals as well as EU's energy independence. So the EU cannot just afford to cut relations with China. The EU seems to be really open to investment from China. It wants to preserve jobs. It wants to keep manufacturing in the EU as well. So I think it's in a very different situation than the US.
Johannes, another thing we've touched on, but if I could press you a bit more on, is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Also, you can talk about Ukraine if you like, but do you think that the European Commission's position provides reassurance? It's another totally unpredictable situation, which is likely to have massive consequences for all of us if the conflict spreads, and it could be happening in the next few months too.
Yeah, looking at both those conflicts at the same time and the risk of extension, I would say that starting with the Ukrainian conflict, it already has, in a way, extended, but as Carl Bildt mentioned earlier, in the hybrid threats and in the cyber domain. So in those arenas, we see a lot of interference and a lot of things happening underneath the surface. And the risk in the Middle East, of course, that has always been a very risky environment, and it has a lot of attention from the security sector side and from the military, securing the freedom of navigation through the Red Sea, for instance, as one direct consequence, and also in the area. But of course, the main risk would be an all-out war in the Middle East. But I'm hopeful in that regard, that I think that all the major players want to have restraint in some way. There are red lines that they don't want to be crossed. And I know that there is a lot of things going on in working with deterrence, and deterrence in a way has failed in the Middle East, especially from the Israeli side from the 7th of October, and also from the Iranian side that failed to protect its protégés. So, but I'm still hopeful that those red lines won't be crossed. But as I said, it's a big uncertainty here as well.
And Yuri, just a question before we move on to our second part. What are the lessons that you have taken from the extreme situation in your country about international cooperation, the help that's been given, also in terms of business? And how, if anything, how do you see the future for a very dangerous landscape, the one you've been describing?
Yeah, it's really very difficult and interesting question. So that's true, because when we work with our clients, we definitely consider, when we build a strategy, we consider different options based on different assumptions. These assumptions are, very, very different. So there are like positive scenarios, so that then the war will end up like this year, or it will end up like in 1 year, in 2 years, or so on and so forth. But being really realistic, we understand that there are no grounds for Russia, for example, to stop the war. And we understand that it's a long journey for Ukraine, so to be in this situation and to fight, right? Here I see like two things. The first one, again, so we have big motivation, but we don't have enough like weapons, resources, and so on and so forth. And here we will definitely rely on the support of Europe and other countries. This is the first one. At the same time, we understand that we need to make our like homework in Ukraine. So, and these days we see a lot of like transformations that I mentioned like before. So the company faced one challenges, but in 1 year, so situation improved and improved, right? So, and these days we see like a lot of like opportunities as well in Ukraine. So here I would like also to touch a bit financial sector. So from financial perspective, all banks provided services to its clients every day. So there was no one day that they stopped to provide services, even like on 21st of February 2022. So I mean, the banking system proved to be resilient, and these days banks are full of liquidity. So and they are looking for good projects. And there are many good projects. So and here, so what we see like another challenge in Ukraine is related to risk management and insurance, right? So because the key risk is military risk, and not all insurance companies are ready to take them, right? And we see that, for example, like big names like Miga provide some coverage for, again, for big names in Ukraine. They managed to have some transactions in that area. Local companies, they are looking for opportunities to make like reinsurance of the risk somewhere abroad, right? So, and we still, I personally I would say more optimistic on the developments in Ukraine, and definitely we do our homework to prepare like different projects, to prepare like different setup for international investors to come in and support and to make business in Ukraine.
Thank you very much indeed. Now I'm going to ask you to stay on the stage, but a big round of applause already for our three first speakers. We're now going to move on to the second theme, the one that we're all more and more concerned about too, which is climate change. And for this, I'd like you to welcome our two specialists, Mark Lewis and Michelle Wooker. Please welcome them. Thank you. I'm sure we're more touched by issues to do with climate change. I'm actually talking to you as somebody who, I live in a small French town. Nobody ever talks about it. It's called Nogent-le-Rotrou. Most French people don't know where it is. I was watching the news last week, and suddenly I hear Nogent-le-Rotrou on the national news. I go down, I look at why they're talking about my town, and I see one of my best friends living in the town whose house had actually been flooded the night before. I didn't even know. I found out watching the television. It suddenly becomes very personal when you see this. I mean, last week she came around for dinner on Friday because she doesn't have a home. There's no electricity in her home, so she came around to my place to eat. It suddenly is starting to become, I've been hosting things about climate change for the last 25 years. It's suddenly starting to get very personal. So I'm sure we're all concerned about it. So we're delighted to have with us two specialists. Mark Lewis, you're an analyst and investor with 30 years experience in financial markets. You've spent the last 20 years specializing in the overlap between energy markets and climate change. You were also a member of the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures, the group that was created by Michael Bloomberg and Mark Carney to consider the financial risks posed by climate change. And we're delighted also to have with us Michelle Wooker. You live in Chicago, but your great-grandparents emigrated from Poland and Bohemia, so I think you were very keen that we pointed out your European roots. They emigrated at the beginning of the 21st century. You're a global strategic advisor and economic policy analyst and the best-selling author of The Grey Rhino and You Are What You Risk. You work to align conversations about risk to help decision makers to better respond to obvious, probable, and impactful crises. So we're delighted to have you with us. I'm going to start with you, Michel. How do you evaluate the risk for different businesses in terms of the different climate questions and energy needs that we've been talking about? And also, if you could say a word about the importance to conduct regular analyses. Do people listen to this? Do people use it? And if so, in what way?
Well, you know, it's interesting. In the States, over the last couple of weeks, we saw one big whopping hurricane after another. Helene, followed by Milton in Florida. Luckily, my cousins in Fort Myers were okay. No damage. But we've started to see things that I certainly hadn't thought about. But, you know, people coming out, politicians, elected officials coming out and saying that the government was controlling the weather. And we've been seeing attacks on federal emergency management teams. That was not on my 2024 bingo card at all. But I think overall, it's amazing. We've been hearing for years that things were going to start getting worse. And we're in many cases seeing things worse than we could have imagined. We've also seen a real need to update some of these scenarios and predictions. I mean, the FEMA flood maps, for example. There are people who are saying, okay, well, we were prepared for a 100-year flood, but not a 1,000-year flood. So a lot of these things are happening bigger and faster than people thought of. But you know, in general, my work focuses a lot on moving from this identification and analysis phase to the action phase. And so I don't want to belabor the importance of scenarios, particularly since they're going even beyond what we think, but really the importance of connecting what we learn from those analyses to actions and doing things. And I think there's a fantastic role that risk managers and insurers can play in that.
Okay, well, I'll ask you a few questions, and I'm sure that the others will give their views on climate change too. Mark, I think it would be quite interesting if you explain the background, the object, and the impact of the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. For those of us who haven't followed the whole ins and outs of it, could you talk us through it?
Yeah, so the TCFD was set up by Mike Bloomberg and Mark Carney in 2015 at the Paris COP. Last time I was in this room, by the way, was the COP in Madrid in 2019, so it's nice to be back. And the idea behind it was to say there's lots of scientific work going on around climate change, but what are the financial risks posed by climate change? And really, Mark Carney set out the ideas behind the formation of the TCFD in a speech to Lloyd's of London, the insurance market, in September of 2015. In a wonderful speech, I would recommend you all read it if you're interested in climate change risk and the financial risk. It's called The Tragedy of the Horizon. Okay, now, what's the tragedy of the horizon? Well, probably a lot of you are familiar with the concept of the tragedy of the commons. That's a well-established economic concept whereby if you have an asset in common, and typically the example used is pasture land, but there is unregulated access to that, you will find that people abuse that access, and the value of the asset to the community as a whole is ultimately destroyed over time. Now, the tragedy of the horizon takes that one step further and says, what we really have in common is the atmosphere, and there's a limit to the amount of CO2 we can continue to put into the atmosphere, but we have a time constraint as well. So if we don't stop the amount of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere in time, global warming will become catastrophic and irreversible. So that's the tragedy of the horizon. The way I like to think about it is, you know, Woody Allen famously said in one of his films, comedy is tragedy plus time. And climate change is the tragedy of the horizon, of the commons, plus the tragedy of the horizon. So if comedy is tragedy plus time, climate change is tragedy plus tragedy. And the best work on climate change was actually written by William Shakespeare in the 17th century, his most famous play, Hamlet. Because what is the tragedy of Hamlet? The tragedy of Hamlet is he faces this terrible dilemma of having to act, and he can't act. That's Hamlet's tragedy. He takes too long, he hesitates, he vacillates, and at the end of the play, everybody dies. We have to avoid the tragedy of Hamlet. We have to act, and acting means responding to the signals. So coming back to the tragedy of the horizon and what Carney was getting at, and what we as a task force were given to do, was to come up with a categorization of the risks, financial risks, that climate change gives rise to, and come up with a way for firms, whether we're talking about insurance companies, corporates, anybody who could suffer eventually from the financial risks of climate change, to think more clearly about this. And we really came up with 3 major kinds of risks. The first one, the most obvious one, is the physical risk of climate change, which insurance companies have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And we heard in the President's remarks at the beginning, increasingly many activities are becoming uninsurable around the world, and many geographical locations are becoming uninsurable. That will only increase the longer we keep putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So physical risk is the first risk. Then we have liability risk or legal risk. This is the risk that at some point in the future, and in fact it's already happening, fossil fuel companies in particular will be subject to legal cases brought against them for knowing what they were doing to the environment and not acting. In fact, having disinformation campaigns around it, much as the tobacco companies had to deal with. So there's a parallel there between what the tobacco industry went through in the 80s and 90s and the litigation, and what we might start to see for the fossil fuel industry. And then thirdly, which is the risk I focus most on in my day-to-day work, this is what we call transition and policy risk, or transition and technology risk, whereby technology is developing very quickly, renewable energies are becoming more and more competitive, and policymakers are putting in place frameworks to encourage an accelerated take-up of renewable energy. This leads to all kinds of disruption in the global energy system, and in Europe we've been leading the way on that, although China is catching up very quickly. So those 3 key risks were really what we were tasked with delineating and recommending that companies come up with solutions to. And the first solution is to disclose it, because you can't take action on something unless you're measuring the risk. And so making a conscious effort to analyze and disclose the risk so that there's more information for all stakeholders in the financial system to make informed judgments on.
Sorry, can I just ask,
yeah.
Disclose to who exactly?
Well, disclose to anybody who has a stake in the global financial system, which is ultimately everybody, right? In my role, I was a financial analyst covering the utility industry. The utility industry, which most people think of as a really boring industry, and when I started 30 years ago, the utility industry, many people said to me, why are you going into utilities? It's really boring, nothing ever happens, it's only for widows and orphans. That was typical, the utility industry was a very safe industry, pays dividends, so it's called typically, where you recommend that widows and orphans put their money in because it's very safe. However, it's been a very unsafe industry over the last 20 years because renewable energy has disrupted the electricity generation industry enormously, and as a result, the market capitalization of the utility industry has fallen dramatically in Europe over the last 20 years, and that has implications for anybody who has their savings invested in there, or insurance companies who are insuring these activities. So it ripples right across the entire global financial system. I remember once back in 2002, long before climate change was as high on the agenda as it is today, speaking to the CEO of a large German utility company, and he said to me, look, we don't need to worry about solar energy. Solar energy will never, ever, ever be competitive commercially in Europe. And now solar energy is the cheapest form of energy available in Europe. The biggest lesson I have learned from 20 years covering this is that things move more quickly than people realize. The climate is changing more quickly than people realize. The policy framework around it is changing more quickly than people realize. And you have to be aware of these risks, and you have to start preparing for them.
Michelle, I saw you nodding. Are we living in a more and more uninsurable world?
Absolutely. Well, this is, of course, a U.S. perspective, but I think it's a really great comparative perspective. And a lot of the headlines we see the most of are homeowners, are auditors, but I think they're very, very strong parallels to business insurance as well. And it's really a mix of regulatory issues and pricing issues, pricing above all. I think that insurance in drought and flood and wildfire-prone areas has been too low for quite a ways too long, and now they're looking at it, and insurers aren't sure that they can get the rate increases they want, and so they're wanting to pull out. Every day it seems like there's another headline about another insurer pulling out of Florida, pulling out of California, and then there's the evil insurer stories that are coming out. The one that the woman who was doing some renovations, and there was a drone, the insurer flew a drone over her property and saw the mess and dropped her because of all this debris in the yard, and she's like, well, I'm making it better. And then the other one, this breaks my heart. A woman, I believe it was in California, had a big old protected tree in her yard, and the insurer was telling people to clear out all the brush within however many feet, and the city prohibited her from chopping down the tree. So she ended up basically with her home being uninsurable, and wasn't her fault, and everybody was caught between a rock and a hard place. So I think you're seeing some really big problems with insurability. I know there have been lots of worries that the clients have asked me about for quite some years now around capitalization for increasing freak extreme weather events, and for anything that's been aggressively invested, that's eased a little bit of those worries, but there are lots of doubts about where the global economy is going, so that kind of brings some of the capitalization risk back to the table. And there are political risks. I mean, like the ones I just mentioned that I would never even have thought about. But these bad insurer company headlines are coming in there. So I think we need really we need a public active dialogue among risk managers, insurers, policymakers, regulators about really trying to get at an accurate...
We don't have that already. It seems like from the outside it would seem incredible that you're saying this even, that we need a dialogue.
Well, I think there's some dialogue, but I think that people aren't always asking the right questions. And I think the questions are always about what are the risks, what are the probabilities of the risks, and a lot of those just go out of whack. And I think it's about other questions, like how is the burden best shared and transferred? How do we most efficiently transfer the burden? How do we ensure that everybody's insured? You look at flood insurance, because these maps are out of date in the US, and I'm sure also in the world. You've got people who've been told, oh, you don't need flood insurance, and they're like, well, my house just got washed away.
Well, my friend was told she couldn't be flooded because they spent millions of euros protecting the river in my little French town, but unfortunately they didn't protect the estuaries of the little river, and that's what flooded. It's the unpredictability of it.
Exactly, and it gets to this mitigation question. When I was writing the Grey Rhino, I went up to Calgary, which had their big floods in 2013, and they did something very interesting. The government was reimbursing homeowners, but they said, we're only going to reimburse you, we're going to pay for resilience measures, but you have to put them in to get the whole package. And so I think that there are things that policymakers and insurers can cooperate on. Or, for example, a lot of my friends have those little gadgets you put in your car that says whether you drive well or not. And I was borrowing a friend's car, and I freaked out every time I brake for a pothole or an idiot driver. And I went, I'm not a crazy driver. I'm like a granny driver, and it's going to say I'm nuts. Or there are things like, if you have a fire extinguisher, your home insurance is going to be cheaper. I think that we could see a lot more of that around climate-type issues, and that has the added benefit of making people feel like they are doing something. And no matter how little it is, when people feel like they're doing something, they are more likely to do more things. Or also, when you have these crazy, unpredictable storms where people are insured, they thought they were insured enough, the insured thought that they had enough money there to cover it, and they don't. Well, at the end, the government's going to be left holding the bag, and they're going to have to come. So I think that there needs to be a lot deeper and more rigorous conversation about really what the potential impacts are and how to make sure that everybody is participating in reducing the risk, in increasing resilience, and in making sure that there is a better mechanism for transferring the risk when there is a crazy out-of-whack storm.
Mark, it's also to do with people's pockets, isn't it? For example, the carbon pricing thing. I mean, is that the way that it's going to have a real effect on people? I live in France. When they tried to put up the petrol prices, all the farmers went out in the street and they had to listen to them. How far does carbon pricing have to go before it actually affects policy?
Yeah, well, I don't know how many people in this room would know what the price of carbon is today in Europe. Why don't we have a show of hands? How many people know what the price of carbon is in Europe today, the traded price of CO2 in Europe?
We don't seem to have too many people putting that.
That's quite interesting. So CO2 trades at 62 euros a ton at the moment. We've been as high as 100 euros a ton 2 years ago, in summer of 2002. It probably has to go to 200, 250 over time to solve the problem. But my point is, the Gilets jaunes and everything that came with that, yes, it was very dramatic because people saw the impact at the pump. But there's actually a price on CO2 already out there, and even a very well-informed room like this doesn't know what it is. I think that tells us something about the way you can make policy changes in a way that doesn't attract all this negative criticism. The other thing I want to say is there's a lot you can do before you even put a price on carbon. I mean, the IMF, this is not Greenpeace, it's not Friends of the Earth, the IMF, in its most recent estimate of the level of fossil fuel subsidies, said there are $7 trillion a year of subsidies on fossil fuels. That is, we are giving money to ourselves to incinerate the planet. This is insane. Okay, if you take $7 trillion away from subsidies to fossil fuel companies, guess what will happen? They won't have the same incentive to burn fossil fuels. So there's a lot of policy stuff here that just needs to be more carefully thought out. And one other thing about carbon pricing you're going to be hearing a lot more about in the next few years is the impact on trade, because Europe is in the process of putting in place what's called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. That means that that carbon price I was just talking about, of 62 euros a ton rising over time, will be applied to any company from outside Europe that wants to sell into the European market goods that are covered by that. So if you want to sell steel from China into Europe, from 2026, you're going to have to start paying the same carbon price as European. Now, of course, and you mentioned Trump and trade already a hot potato in a geopolitical sense. This will become all the more so when Europe starts saying, if you want to sell into our market, you have to pay the price of carbon. I was astonished, truly astonished. In May, I attended a dinner with Al Gore. Al Gore, best known, of course, for being one of the world's most vigorous champions in the fight against climate change. But even Al Gore has his limits, I learned, in that the dinner took place the day after Joe Biden announced that he was going to put tariffs on cars, electric vehicles from China. And I said to Al Gore at the dinner, this makes no sense. You know, this is going to fragment the fight against climate change. If we want to solve climate change, we need to electrify transportation globally as quickly as possible, and this will actually prevent our doing this because the Chinese can do this more cheaply than anybody else. And Al Gore, of all people, said, you're absolutely right. but we can't afford to let the Chinese get too far ahead of us from an industrial perspective. And in any case, they're subsidizing their renewable energy too aggressively. And I thought, wow, if Al Gore is saying this, we really do have a problem, because trade and climate change are going to come increasingly into conflict, or let's say trade and climate policy are going to come increasingly into conflict going forward.
I'd like to bring in
If I actually have some
sorry, do you want
many
to
thoughts on this, many many thoughts. You know, the $7 trillion IMF figure. I see that a lot, and what's interesting about that is it's broken out. Some of that $7 trillion is in paying for cleaning up the mess, and some of it is tax breaks, you know, R&D and things like that, and some of it goes to helping people pay for their gas. But however you slice and dice that, you look at a lot of the numbers of what it takes to invest to get to the numbers we need to reduce it, and they're all over the place, but you see a sort of a concentration around $2 to $3 trillion a year. So it's like if we just stop paying for that, then that helps to solve part of the problem. And then the whole solar and clean energy tariffs and subsidies debate makes me bonkers, because with taxes, what you do is if you don't want something, or if you want less of something, you tax it. And if you want more of something, then you either don't tax it or you subsidize it.
Right.
Well, we want governments to be putting money into solving the climate problem, and we see that carrots often work a lot better than sticks. So rather than this beggar thy neighbor thing, there needs to be a global conversation about that. And at the same time, this whole US versus China framing ignores the fact that there are so many developing countries that don't have the finance for this stuff at all, that have the opportunity to leapfrog over all of the dirty technologies that the developed countries have been using. And those developing countries, interestingly, also are the ones with the least insurance penetration. And so there's so much that could be done by reframing this discussion as, let's solve these world problems together. And you know, we've seen, you know, even the US and Europe have been bumping heads a bit over subsidies to clean energy. And we need to wipe the table clean and restart that conversation from the point of view of, you know, we tax dirty things, we tax carbon, and we subsidize things that reduce carbon, and let's all do it together in a way that gets the whole world covered.
$7 trillion is 7% of global GDP. Global GDP is about $100 trillion. So that is an enormous amount.
It's a lot of money.
I'm listening to you. Well, I'd like to bring other three panelists back in now. It seems to be there's two trends we're talking about. We're talking about the contradiction between long-term policy, which has to be long-term policy as it's the environment, and short-term policy, like what's happening in 2 weeks' time with China and trade, and what's happening in the conflicts in the world. And there's also the contradiction between acting on a local level, which is more what you have to do to sort out climate problems from an insurance point of view on what's happening on the ground to your clients, and what's going on in international cooperation. We need international cooperation to sort out the problems that we're talking in terms of conflict and the risks that involves. Isn't the problem, Barbara, perhaps I could turn to you, that it's a question of making policy to deal with these kinetic balls have been moving up and down, symbolizing how unsure the world is at the moment. Isn't this like juggling all these autonomous things that are happening? How can policymakers, when you get countries like in the two countries I know most about, which is the UK and France, they don't even know if there's going to be a government in France. Michel Barnier doesn't know if he's going to get the budget through. They're debating it today. If at the end of the week he's going to be able to finance anything to do with the environment, let alone people's health and so forth. How do you make policy in this world? Vast question. Short reply again.
I don't know if I have an answer for that. And especially in Europe, there is this huge challenge of making something out of a lot of fragmented visions of reality. For Europe, much more than for the US, for China, and for many other countries. How can we enact these broad-based, comprehensive, ambitious, well-funded strategies if we have a lot of fragmentation, not only within countries, but within the EU itself? And it's very hard, because every reform has winners and it has losers. You see, Germany, it's much more reliant on a fossil fuel economy than many other European countries, especially the Nordic countries. So there's a lot of backlash, especially from German automotives. So how can you, for example, the EU has this target in 2035, we will be only sell electric vehicles. And while for some countries this is, has been accepted, has been, well, companies are working towards this transition. Others, especially in Germany and other countries which have, for example, Czechia, a very strong automotive space, well, there's a lot of pushback. They are trying to change the legislation. They are trying to revert back to what we had before. So it's not an obvious question. It requires a lot of will. It requires a lot of political consensus. And what we've seen is actually more or less the contrary. With the European elections and with recent elections in France and many other smaller European countries, we've seen this rise of support for the far right. Many of those, they deny climate change, they are against climate policies. So the challenge, it's very big, especially in Europe because of this huge fragmentation.
Johannes, maybe a word on the difficulty of making policy in short term and in the long term, because most politicians are here today and before tomorrow they're gone.
Yeah, I'm thinking about adding like a military perspective on that agenda, and I think there is a really clear linkage between the long term and the short term, because the long term effects of climate change are affecting the security situation right at the moment. It's reinforcing some of the old conflicts and some of the old problems, like, for instance, climate migration, and it's also reinforcing the conflicts of scarce resources as water, for instance, and we will probably see more conflicts arising in those areas of scarce resources. But it also opens up new areas for conflict, and I'm thinking especially of the Arctic. By the ice pulling back, it opens up for military operations, and we see that both China and Russia now is operating very aggressively in those areas as well, and trying to claim new areas and the resources that are freed under the ice and so on. So it's probably links back to where, and I know that most military organizations are watching climate change and working in policies, and both the EU military side and the NATO is also working on looking at the climate change and how to work with that as of now. So I think there is really a clear link between the long term and the short term.
Could I actually just push back a little bit on this long-term versus short-term, because it comes up a lot in the climate debate. And I think with climate, we're talking short-term. You know, last summer, or a year ago, I remember the wildfires in Canada were so bad that Chicago briefly was rated #1, woohoo, as the worst polluted big city in the world. And you know, so many of these things are here right now, and we are seeing projections that if we don't get X done by 2030, or at least by 2050, well, that's kind of medium. It's not, I mean, it depends on how short you say short term is, but 2030 is not that far away. 2050 is not that far away. So I really want to really challenge this use of long term with climate change. It's here right now.
Absolutely, and a very good way of reinforcing that point is to look at food prices of some selected commodities this year. So a lot of people are probably aware, this is something we look at, we invest in these kinds of things. We're a commodity hedge fund. Cocoa, price of cocoa has gone from $1,500 a ton 3 years ago to a maximum this year so far, at least, of $11,500 a ton. It's currently trading at around $7,000 a ton. Why? Because there's been 2 very, very poor global crops of cocoa, and 60% of global cocoa comes from West Africa, which is suffering the physical effects of climate change. But it's not just cocoa, it's coffee, it's orange juice, and eventually this is going to become such a structural problem that we're going to be all worrying about food prices as well. So just to throw that into the mix. And obviously, food and water, I mean, Johannes mentioned water. I mean, this is what the wars of the future will be fought over, I think.
I'd like to just hand over to Yuri, who we haven't heard from a little while. You've been watching the discussion on climate change. I'd just like to ask you, to what extent you touched on it when you were telling us about the idea of risk in Ukraine, but when you're living in the situation you're living in, is climate change also a worry, or?
Absolutely. So this is also like a challenge and see actually on the table. So on the top level discussions, definitely, right? So here I will just comment maybe on 2 things. So that production decreased in Ukraine, so due to the war, but at the same time, so there is like negative effect on the environment by the war. So because we have a lot of explosion, a lot of fights, I mean, it's terrible if you go like Easter, so you see like black forest after the day before it and so on and so forth. The water is terrible, the pollution, the air is terrible and so on and so forth. It was like another damage to the atmosphere, right? So, but again, so there is another topic. I will tell you more from financial perspective that our regulator puts pressure on the banks just to have this ESG agenda. So as well. So, and if like 10 years ago, so ESG was like something strange, and you had to explain the companies what does it mean, so on, what is it about, right? So right now, so all big corporates and companies clearly understand so that what is ESG and especially E, right? So and again, so I guess this is a bit like if you want a part of the, I mean, we definitely want to be part of the Europe, so and we need to follow the EU regulations, and we do our homework in that area as well. So it's no doubt.
Okay, there's lots of other things to say, but we have 10 more minutes. You're in front of the European risk managers. I'd like you all to conclude, just 1 or 2 minutes if you could, to say how you think, based on your experience, what advice or what comments would you make on the role of risk management faced with the geopolitical risks we've been talking about and faced with the climate risks we've been talking about? What should be the takeaways for all the risk managers we have here in Madrid?
I mean, I would say there's a lot of inertia in the system, so we keep making this point about climate change is a long-term problem, but it is happening now already. The problem is there's a lot of inertia in the system, which means things will get worse before they get better. So, you know, we're meant to be reducing emissions according to the IPCC, which is the global UN scientific body that says if we're to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, which is to stabilize the average global temperature to no more than between 1.5 and 2 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures, global emissions need to fall by 40% by 2030 versus 2019 levels. They're still going up, right? I mean, it's been a catastrophic failure, the way the world has dealt with what the scientific community has been telling us about climate change. So the first thing you have to get ready for is things are going to get worse. You know, emissions are going to carry on going up in the short term, and all these things we've been talking about, the physical impact, the risk of flooding, the risk of wildfires, the risk of higher food prices. I'm afraid this is going to get worse before it gets better, and, you know, draw your conclusions accordingly and plan for that.
It's a gloomy message, but it's put well, maybe the truth. Michelle.
Well, I agree, but I want to try to inject at least a little bit of hope into this situation. And one of the things that gets us through when things seem really bad is the ability we can do something. I mean, sometimes people run around screaming, do something, somebody, anybody, just do something. And we'll often do the wrong thing. But I think moving from that identification to action, really seizing a sense of agency, saying, hey, what is my company doing? What are our suppliers, our partners doing? How can we help our clients to do more of this? And then, with the whole regulation and policy conversation, absolutely agree that disclosure is an important first step, but we've been talking about disclosure and people have been disclosing for quite a while now, and there was a lot of discussion in the US over the SEC's new proposal about disclosure, and I was looking at some of the estimates as to how much that was costing companies, depending on the size, and it was mind-boggling, and I thought, can't we find a way to get people to use that money to just go ahead and reduce already? Once they've disclosed once, or can they just accept some blanket high level of disclosure and say, okay, we're going to take that money and put it towards fixing the problem because we've been disclosing and it's all right already with the disclosing, as much as I'm in favor of disclosing.
Johannes.
Yeah, and I was really interested by the inauguration speech here with uninsurable areas and uninsurable places and so on, and I think that's very interesting. And unfortunately, I have to agree with Mark here that even in the geopolitical side and in the security side, it's going to get worse, a lot worse, before it gets better. And we will probably see, as a takeaway from your side, it's that there will be more areas that will be uninsurable and more things that is hard to figure out, and hopefully those red lines for the most of the world leaders will still be there, so we mitigate the risks and we can start to get back to a more safe and secure society. But there are uncertain times ahead, definitely.
Baba.
Yes. So from a macroeconomics perspective, but maybe more from an economic security perspective, I think it's very important to look at what the last few years they have taught us. And I think one, supply chain risks, they have come to the fore. And I think we have to pay ever greater attention to them, especially given fragmentation. In my personal opinion, supply chains are going to be completely revamped in the next decade. There is also the risk from disruptions from war and conflict. We've seen that with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So we have to reassess, I think, our exposures, our vulnerabilities to account for these ever-rising geopolitical tensions. Think the Strait of Hormuz that I mentioned before. Think if there is a potential escalation in the conflict between China and Taiwan, we could have disruptions in the Strait of Taiwan, through which passes around a quarter of global manufacturing shipping transit. I think also, as Mark mentioned before, there is the risk of supply-induced price volatility. We didn't necessarily see a lot of that in the past, but with climate change, geopolitical tensions, this, I think, will be a topic for the future. We have to keep that in mind. Also the risk related, especially for Europe, regarding energy dependence. Until we are energy independent, we have to account for disruptions in energy supplies. They are a possibility. Yeah, and I think from a geopolitical point of view, I think risk managers will have more or less to become political analysts from now on. They have to focus not only on the political environment, but also on the policy environment. It's changing very quickly, and it will continue to attest to this change in this multipolar global order that we are observing.
And you really difficult task?
Oh yes, actually, from my side, I will just say that from our lessons in Ukraine, so that everything is possible. So, and I wish next time we discuss like rebuild Ukraine and just more positive sides for Ukraine and the world.
Thank you very much indeed. We're very honored that you came today under very difficult circumstances. Thank you. And to all of you, stay please sitting for 2 more minutes, but a massive round of applause. It's been maybe not the most optimistic roundtable, but I think we've actually followed on from Carl Bildt's speech about the situation that we all face ourselves in the world and how we as an industry are dealing with it. I just have 1 or 2 things to tell you about what's going to happen next. If you want to tell us what you have thought of the session, you can scan the QR code on the slide, select room plenary, and you can complete the 5 questions, and you can insult us, or you can be nice, or you can send us whatever you like in terms of comments. It's very useful when we organize things like this that you tell us what you think of it. So the program for the afternoon, during lunch, do not miss the 20 minutes fast-track learning session about the European Risk Management Certification remap at the FERMA stand at 1:30. That's 13:30. Then you will have workshops from 2 till 3:30. There will be a coffee break from 3:30 to 3:50, during which there will be another fast track about the EU AI Act at the FERMA stand, some of the things we've been talking about. And afterwards, Michel will be at the FERMA stand. I forgot to mention, between 3 and 3:30, I think he will be there. There will be another series of workshops between 4 and 5:30. There will be the ladies' networking cocktail, which is open to anyone, whether you define yourself as a lady or not, at 17:45. And last but not least, please feel free to stop by the Insotech corner to hear about the solutions developed by the startups present. There are pitches for this all afternoon. So my goodness me, it sounds like you've got a very busy afternoon. And for those of you who missed the absolutely fantastic introduction, because some of you came in late, please be on time tomorrow, because you will be able to see another fantastic opening with our autonomous kinetic balls, which we will be performing again live for you at the beginning tomorrow. What time, Tiffen, does it start tomorrow morning? I've forgotten. I think. Oh, it's the afternoon, right, okay. Well, please be on time tomorrow afternoon to see these fantastic kinetic balls performing autonomously to symbolize the risky world that we all live in. Thank you very much indeed, and bon appétit. Have a nice lunch. Thank you once again to our fantastic panel.